playing for us this morning. Thank you, Leslie. She runs down here and plays, and she runs back upstairs and leads the rehearsal. So thank you. There's a lot of running going on. It's a real gift that she gives us. So I really appreciate you leading us in song and in worship. You've got paper on the table with some pens if you want to take notes, but also if you have any questions following any of these episodes, you can write a question down. And I think the most helpful thing to do now is just you can put it on the podium and I'll pick it up and then I'll try to address it next week. Just a little bit of a calendar update or heads up. Next Sunday is the final Jericho Road of this fall semester because we'll take a break for Thanksgiving, and then the first Sunday of December we're doing something that the vestry asked me to do a few years ago, which is a semi-annual town hall meeting. It's a time where we have all the Sunday school classes, the adult classes meet down here, and I talk to you about the state of the church, things that are going on, things that you need to know. It's one opportunity for you to get a 30,000 foot look at St. Luke's, because there's so much going on and sometimes you can miss it. And we'll give you an update on stewardship, how that's going, and things like that. So what I thought we might do, which might be fun, is next Sunday, being the final one of the semester, is do a recap. I'd like to hit the high points of what we learned, and also maybe do a few of the greatest hits, especially a few of the videos that were really well received. I think it really might be fun to sort of look through the fall together at where we've been with Jericho Road. What I want to do next semester is work with this table. If you haven't written it down, this is something that you might want to jot down in a moment and stick in the back of your Bible. And I'm going to tell you why this is helpful. This is basically, I'm calling this Framing Paulus. Paulus being Paul's first century name, because I want us to help use Paulus's his relationships and his churches. I want us to use Paulus's experiences as a reference point, but also a source for our ethics. And so that next semester, I would like for us to work through this center column. What we've been doing this semester is recreating the world of Paul. I'll continue to do that, setting a context. For instance, for the last few weeks, we've done Paul and God, Paul and Jesus. This morning, Paul and people, we've done that. I'm going to talk about Paul and the city. Paul and the city, to sort of end our contextual learning. But the next semester, beginning in January, we'll begin working through this center column. Why is this important? Well, I want you to notice, first of all, that I've got numbers here, and these are actually the books in order, but I've taken some of these books. They're not books, they're letters. The word Bible means books, and it's a library of texts. And so they're history books and poetry books, and Gospels, of course, which are different, and then there are letters in the back. So I've used the word books, but they're really letters. I've taken these letters and I've put them in the center column for an important reason. First reason, we believe that these letters in the center column are undisputed writings of Paulus. These are undisputed writings. These are letters in which committees of biblical scholars have come together, and they have no doubt. This column here, there's a little bit of debate. Now, I promise you, we have no trouble if someone says, I believe Paul wrote all of them, because it says in the backs of my Bible that it's Paul's letter to the Ephesians. I believe Paul wrote it. That's okay. That's a historical, scholarly debate that we really don't have to have. But for the purposes of an ethic, this may be important, because when people ever have a problem with the teachings of Paul, and what would a problem like that might be? Well, the problem might be he seems a little harsh when it comes to the treatment of women. Sometimes it just seems a little unfair, a little archaic. Why do we have to still do first century things, with head coverings, or woman's place is, under her husband, or things like that. There are things like that, and in Paul's writings that people find offensive. Anti-Semitism, there's some anti-Semitism in parts of these letters in the backs of our Bible. There's great concern for those who are out, those who are in, those kinds of, this dichotomy between saved and unsaved. Well, what I want you to know is that, and this is a rough statement, but it's fair, a rough statement, but if you look at these writings, this is where you generally find the questionable stuff, not in these. Okay? Now there are some insertions, and I showed you one of those last week, but you generally find them over here. That's the first reason why I want you to have these columns, because if you've ever had a problem with Paul, you might not have a problem with Paul. That's what I'm going to suggest to you. The reason for that is because these writings typically happen toward the end of the first century. So Jesus lived in the first part of the first century. These happened at the end of the first century, and some important things were happening. First of all, in the year 70, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Judaism was dispersed. So both Judaism and Christianity, which had come under the watchful eye of Rome, and not in a positive way, were both religions that were very closely related, at first indistinguishable from each other. We're both closely related and also at odds with each other. And there's no fight like a family fight. So that's where you get some of that harsh, anti-Semitic sounding stuff, because these two groups are fighting for their survival. Church order was important, and so there were later leaders or teachers taking Paul's lead. Paul, as we believe, died in the year 67. So around the year 70, 80, 90, taking Paul's lead, beginning to structure the church, beginning to organize it. The church here in the center column is really more of a people. A people. The church is the people. In other words, Paul has made great pains to say, I know you think that Simon Peter's great because he knew Jesus. He fished with him and he camped out with him and he slept with him in the Garden of Gethsemane. I know you think that James, the just, is great back in Jerusalem because he's the brother of Jesus. I got this. Paulus went to all of these places and he said, guess what? I see him too. I see him in you. I see him in Philippi, I see him in Thessalonica, I see him in Corinth, I see him in Galatia, I see him in all these places. So Paul says in this center here, this is an ethic where he says the church is not something that you go to, it's not something that you structure, it's not something that you fight over, it's you. It's you. St. Luke's is you, okay? This is the church. It's us gathered. We are Jesus in this room. And so you begin to see really more of this pure ethic of a people becoming Jesus for each other than you do a place or something that needs to be argued over or led or beginning to be structured. Does that make sense? These are later first century things. They're valuable. They're scripture. They contain in them saving words of God. They are amazing, but they're not what we're going to study for the purposes of this class, which is to recreate the world of Paulus, not the late first century, but rather the mid to heading into the end of the third quarter of that century. So this table is helpful. This can help us place things. I want to remind you that the book of Acts is about Paul. It's not by Paul. It's about Paul. It's about Peter at first, and then it's about Paul. About 2/3 of it about Paul. These are the letters by Paulus, and then these are letters that were probably written ascribed to Paul. Well, let's keep going. So, what does it mean to have the ethic of Jesus? Well, what I want us to think about is not saying, I want you all to come to church every Sunday, a month of Sundays. I want you to come to church all the time. That's not what I talk about when I mean the ethic of Jesus. What I mean is, how do we take the precepts of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and how do we apply it to our everyday lives? How do business people become Christian business people? Neighbors become Christian neighbors. Teachers become Christian teachers. Docs become Christian docs. Nurses become Christian nurses, and so on and so on. Not in that cheesy, wrap your faith around the American flag way. I don't mean that. I mean, how do we deeply become integrated Christian people in what we do? How can Christianity make a difference? And I'm going to attempt to make a little bit of that case today. Sometimes I will find things that absolutely blow me away. And I want to share one of these with you. This is an advertisement from Airbnb. You know about Airbnb? Airbnb is a new way of securing a hotel or room, renting a room from an individual. But whoever their advertising person is, had a really thoughtful ad that integrates, I believe, the ethic of Jesus. Just watch it. It's just a minute long. See what you think.
Berlin, 1987. My father was a guard on the west side of the Berlin Wall, while another man guarded the east. Eventually the wall came down, but even after moving away, my father carried a piece of it with him. While I grew up, it lingered over all of us, a barrier between him and the rest of the world. I decided I would help by taking him back to Berlin to show him the beautiful place it had become. When we arrived, the stranger who answered the door became familiar. The guard who patrolled the opposite side of the wall now welcomed us as a friend. After that, things were better for my father. Airbnb. Belong anywhere.
Okay, that just knocked me out. Has anybody seen that? Isn't that wonderful? We have a name for the key. The key is Jesus. The key that unlocked the man's burden is Jesus. We have a name for the key. And so what I hope that we'll do together, and we're continuing to do together as we learn about Paulus, is we're really learning to live like Jesus. Jesus took this ethic, this teaching, and let me remind you about the center column, one more important thing. The distance between Paulus's writings and the life of Jesus is about the same distance as our time from 9/11. The distance from the Gospels to the life of Jesus is about the distance from our time to, I've said the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, something in the 60s, the beginning of the Vietnam War, Cold War, whatever. In other words, it's still within living memory for many of us, if not most of us, but many, many things have happened that have colored our view of the world, including things like the fall of the Berlin Wall. Many, many things have colored our view of the world since the 60s, right? 9/11 is fresher. 9/11 still is more vivid and more forming in our imagination. So just remember that Paulus is close to the source. Well, before we talk about Paul in the city, I want to talk about Jesus in the country and the ethic of Jesus. This is by the shore of the Sea of Galilee. I took this picture. This is right outside of a village called Capernaum. If we only had the stories of Jesus in Capernaum, and we only had those, it would still be the greatest story ever told. Jesus appeared seemingly out of nowhere on the banks of this beautiful freshwater lake. The village of Capernaum is still there, or the remains of it are still there. He healed like no one ever healed. He talked like no one ever talked. He spoke like no one ever spoke. But make no mistake, the context of the Gospels are different. The Gospels sound different than the writings of Paul. They're written in the countryside. Capernaum is a little place. This is a little town. You notice in this picture, there's nothing behind me. There's nothing behind me. On the other side of the shore are the Golan Heights, and then you head into the border of either Syria or Jordan, and I can't really tell from that picture which one, but there's just nothing there. They're just rolling hills, and then this pretty little lake, and a couple little villages. And read the Gospels. Jesus is a little town guy. He talks about farmers and seeds. Remember, he talks about a lost coin, or a lost sheep, or a lost child. It's the story of farmland. It's the story of fishermen. I was thinking of something that a detail that just knocked me out while I was preparing this class, and it's from, if you'll write this down, this is fun. It's from Luke chapter 4 and Luke chapter 5. Jesus heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law in this house. And if you ever go with me to the Holy Land, I'll show you the house. They found it. They found the house where Simon Peter lived, and his mother-in-law lived with them. And Jesus heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law before he ever calls the disciples. He's just appeared in Capernaum, and he teaches, and he's kind of wound the crowds. And Simon Peter's mother-in-law has a fever, and he heals her, and she begins to serve them. Now, what's beautiful about this is that serving them is exactly what Simon Peter's mother-in-law would have wanted to do, and which also gives us evidence and clues as to why Jesus healed at all. He didn't heal in order to prove his existence. Rather, he healed so that people could be more fully alive, so that they could be the people that God made them to be. Hang on to that thought, because that's the reason for the church, too. We're here together so that we can be more fully the people that God made us all to be. Remember that. So Jesus healed people. It wasn't about him, it was about them. So he heals this woman, and she begins to serve them. That's Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 5. The crowds are pressing on him. The word's gotten out. The man has power. Of course, people want to see it. They either want to see the show. Maybe they're not following him for the right reasons, but they're beginning to get excited. And he goes out to a wharf where the fishermen are cleaning their nets. And if you go with me to Capernaum, I'll show you this. There's Simon Peter's house, and then you look a block away, and there's a wharf right here on the sea. It's just right there. Everything's a teeny tiny little place, teeny tiny town. And so Peter is here on the banks of the sea. They've already been fishing. The fishing hour is over. They've caught nothing. And Peter chooses a boat to get in to escape the crowds. Now, what's fun about reading the Gospels as a story and not lifting up chapter and verse, I think oftentimes we ruin the Bible for ourselves by only using it as a code or rule book or doctrine out of the air, and so we pull a chapter or a verse out. We don't read it as a story. The beautiful thing about the story is he chooses Peter's boat. Well, of course he would choose Peter's boat. He knows Peter already. He healed his mother-in-law. The thought that I had, and this is just a Rich Webster way of thinking about the Bible, of course he chooses Simon Peter's boat. Peter owes him a favor, right? I mean, they've got a relationship. They've got a relationship with each other. And so what you get from the Gospels is you get little town stuff. You get farmers and seeds, and you get relationships, and you get masters and slaves, and you get old women, and you get children coming into Jesus' arms, and you get the feeding of 5,000 people with just a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish. These are the kinds of stories. The stories of Paul are different. The stories of Paul are the stories of the city. This is a ruins of a Roman city between Capernaum and Jerusalem, and Jesus never went there. He would stay as far away from a place like this as possible. But this is the world of Paul's. This is the world where Paul has sold tents. This is the world where Paul has traveled. This is the world where Paul has wrote letters. What happened in the world of the city? Well, lots of things happened in the world of the city. Paul was, when he wrote in Philippians chapter 3, he used the language of the gymnasium. I press towards the goal, he says. I'm straining to obtain the salvation given to me in the Lord Jesus Christ. He's using the language of something that they all knew, which were either the Olympics or the Isthmian Games held in Corinth every 2 years. The games, the athlete, the gymnasium. This is the world of Paul. Not farmers and seeds, but rather an urban context. Okay, he used Greco-Roman rhetoric when he speaks to in his first letter to the Corinthians, when he speaks to the people in Corinth. He says, many members make one body. Well, the Greeks knew this. This was their model for the city. The city had many members that make one body. Everybody has a job. In the polis, P-O-L-I-S, the city, everybody had a job, and that made the body. Paul didn't make that up, but he turns it on his head in 1 Corinthians 12:12 when he says, so it is with the body, so it is with Christ. We're not a city, we're Jesus. We're not even a building with a brand new slate roof. We're Jesus, okay? We're Jesus. And he turned it on his head, but by using city things. So Paul used city things. Even the way he talks to them is different. So for instance, Jesus might say, a farmer sowed seeds. And some of the seeds sprang up and then thorns choked them out. You know those stories, parables of farmland. When Paul talks about plants, he almost does it like it's the schoolroom. In Romans 11, he says, but this is when he talks about the Judaism being the branch that we're grafted onto. This is sort of God's plan of salvation. But if some of the branches were broken off in you, a wild olive shoot were grafted in their place to share the rich root of the olive tree. Do not vaunt yourselves over to the branches. For if you vaunt yourselves, remember that it is you that support the root, but the root that supports you. It's clinical. Jesus talked like a guy who had dirt under his fingernails, right? Paul talks like a smart guy who knows something about animal husbandry. I don't know. He's a city guy. He's a city guy. In another place, Paul talks about this. In 2 Corinthians, he was talking about his escape from hardship. And he was just trying to tell them how hard it had been to follow Jesus for the sake of the gospel. On frequent journeys and danger from rivers and danger from bandits and danger from my own people and danger from Gentiles and danger in the city and danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters. And you're thinking, wow, Paul bought a bunch of trouble in his travels. But if you read the original Greek, you could also see that this is a city guy talking, because this word for wilderness is a very specific word. Danger in the wilderness. It is not chlora, which is a Greek word for the productive farmland of Galilee. Okay, chlora would be the rocks and hills and vineyards that Jesus knew outside of the little village of Capernaum, but rather Aremia, which is a word that means nothing. In other words, outside of Birmingham, nothing. Right? Isn't that fun? There's no Shelby County. Just nothing else, right? I cannot leave, a place where there's not a coffee shop, this kind of thing. And it's really intended. I mean, Paul is a man of his place. He's a city guy. He travels around to city places and he says city things. This is why when you read the scripture, or when we go on a Sunday morning, when we read the scripture that comes from an epistle versus that comes from a gospel, they sound different. They're different things, okay? They're different places, different contexts. Within 10 years of the story of Jesus, the movement changed from a rural Palestinian movement to an urban Roman movement. Within 10 years. Much of Paul's ministry, look in his letters, when we look in the center column, we're going to see that about a third of what Paul is concerned with is raising money for the poor cousins in Jerusalem. He just is. He's always raising funds for the poor Christians living in Palestine because they're hungry and they're provincial and they just don't get out much. In a control group, people, if you look at the 91 people that Paul names in the Bible, either named in the book of Acts or Paul names in the Bible, 91 people, 1/3 of those people were Roman citizens. And compared to a control group of first century people, that's 10 times the number of connected people. Paul knew people. Paul was a city guy. To be a Roman citizen was a great advantage, and it cost money to have that kind of citizenship out in the provinces, especially if you weren't a Roman from Italy. In a world of haves and have-nots, to be a Roman citizen was important. And so these people who had connections, who had homes for worship, who had businesses, who had resources, they began the church. And it began as a Roman urban movement only after 10 years of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. It even happened without Paul. Paul just helped to facilitate it, to nurture it, to write to them, to encourage them. But he didn't start the church in Rome. He merely wrote to the church in Rome. So it began in that context. Well, how did it happen? Well, there were some things that facilitated that growth. This class is about Paulus and the city, and I want you to know that the first century world was absolutely ready for the message of Jesus. First of all, the Roman world was a beautiful world and a terrible world. They were longing for the message of the gospel. So how could they get it? How could they get it out there? Well, I think a couple of reasons. I think we can think about two. The reason why the letters of Paulus are from this context and the letter of the works, of rather the Gospels of Jesus, are in his context, right? Galilee, the rocks and fields. Paulus, the Roman cities. The reason for the difference, I think, are twofold. First one, language. Everyone in a Roman city could speak at least some of the same language. Now, you probably know this if you're a travel person. I know some of you know this all too well, that English will get you just about anywhere you need to go in the language of business. English, at least some form of English, can be spoken, will be spoken, because it is the language of commerce. Currently, it is the global language. It may not always be the global language, but currently English is the global language of business. That's just a fact, okay? Now, in Paul's day, it was Greek, but not necessarily the Greek that you might study if you read Homer, or if you read any other kind of famous Greek literature, Aristotle, but rather it was called Koine Greek, which means common Greek. Let me spell it. I should have made a slide. Koine, Koine Greek. It means common Greek, but really what it means is lowest common denominator Greek. Let me get you to use your imagination for a minute. If you're in a city, I'll pick a city of Paulus, let's say Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, they would have had a marketplace called an agora. And in this marketplace, it would have a long center, sort of a center road, and it would have stalls on either side, and you would have people from everywhere selling stuff from all over. Because what you had in the Roman world was something called the Pax Romana, which meant the peace of Rome. And what that simply meant was good roads, good commerce, for good taxes. And that's what it was about, getting your tax money over to the Italian boot to support the empire. And so they had good roads and good commerce. And in Thessalonica, you would have had a marketplace that would have people from all over the Western, or the Eastern Mediterranean. I always get East and West mixed up. The Eastern Mediterranean world, who would have been from all over. So you would have had a peasant working in a stall selling sheepskins. He may have only spoken Aramaic at home, which meant that he was on the lowest rung of the social ladder, which, by the way, is the language Jesus spoke, lowest rung. Then you might have someone who was a worshiping Jew at the synagogue who spoke Hebrew but did not speak Greek or didn't read Greek, and so this person might be the market stall manager. And then you might have the market stall owner who was a Greek-speaking citizen of Thessalonica who was very proud of his Greek heritage, and so that's another person up the rung. Then you might have a Roman citizen who owned the market itself. Now, all of them could communicate with Koine Greek. And all Koine Greek simply was a series of Greek words that could be strung together in a rough kind of way, a little like Spanglish. You familiar with Spanglish? You know, if any of you have been tutoring for STAIR, there are a few Spanish-speaking children now, and I've heard some experiences from some of you where you're having to, use Spanish words or a few English words so that you can begin to communicate. The only Spanish that I can even summon up is dos cervezas, por favor. Now, if you can write, but we all know enough Spanish. Thank you for laughing. Enough Spanish that we could get along. Koine Greek was the same way. They knew enough Greek words so that they could cobble that together. So that's the one thing that kept them together. The second thing, I've already mentioned it, was just simply the sheer mobility. Remember the characters that we've learned together as we've traveled through the world of Paul. In Philippi, he meets a woman named Lydia, a seller of purple cloths. She's from Thyatira, a place far away from Philippi. We meet Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. They're actually Jewish people who were expelled by the Emperor Claudius in the year 45. They're just down there in Corinth because they're in exile. We meet a man named Apollos, who's all the way from the north of Egypt. He's from Alexandria. He's a long way away. And all these people are Christian people, and they're all making the church happen. This is why Christianity became an urban phenomenon. For us, if I could take away two lessons, it would simply be this. Let us remember that we're the church, not St. Luke's. We are Jesus with each other and for each other. Let's remember that. Secondly, let's remember to export our connectivity and our generosity and our ability to change the world. One simple way that I can explain this, I'm not asking you to give more money to the poor, but what I want you to remember is that to much is given, much is expected. And also, let us not take for granted the connectivity that we have that doesn't exist 4.5 miles away down the Red Mountain Expressway. I'll give you an example. We all know a doctor. We all know a lawyer. We all know a banker. We all know a car mechanic. We all know somebody cut our hair. We all know a neighbor. We all know a friend. We all know a specialist. We all know somebody who can help us get through something. We all know a financial planner. We all know people who can help, and we probably grew up with them. And we all know people who can help us make things happen in this world. People living in North Birmingham, they don't know anybody. They don't have any friends. They don't have any friends that can help them with anything. They have hard enough time changing a tire. So let us remember to export not only our funds, but our connectivity, which is exactly what Paulus's friends did. They leveraged this very real capital, both financially and human capital, and they made the church happen for other people. I'll be honest with you, I'm at a place where I didn't begin. I began this summer doing research for the world of Paulus. I had no idea that Paulus lived in such a connected world. It blew me away. The comparisons between over-the-mountain communities and the world of Paul are astounding to me. So let us remember that Christ expects us to be his hands and his feet. And he gave us a beautiful world because he wants us to share. Don't feel guilty for the blessings that we have, but let's help others have it too. Just a small example, let's help them get a grocery store. That's all. They just want a grocery store. So just remember that this is what it means to be an urban church and for Christianity to be an urban movement. This is the world of Paulus. We've studied this, but I want to recap it with you for a minute. Jesus lived, he was born in Nazareth, died in Jerusalem. This is the Sea of Galilee. Here's Capernaum on the lake. The distance between Capernaum and Jerusalem are the same distance between Birmingham and Prattville. And he never went any farther than that. That's it. That's the world of Jesus. This is the world of Paul. Now, he took 3 missionary journeys. We talked about this, but I want to give it to you in a really brief form so that you can get your mind around it. His first missionary journey started from Antioch and went about that far. Not very far. His second missionary journey, all this happened in the last third of his life, by the way. He did all this as a man in middle age. So just remember, God can surprise us with new jobs at any time, all right? So the second missionary journey starts here, it goes on around here, and this is rough to say, but it's essentially true. He founds the churches that we find in the backs of our Bible on the second missionary journey. And then on the third missionary journey, he travels here once again and he writes them letters. So the letters that we have come from that third journey, roughly speaking. The churches are founded in the second journey, roughly speaking. Okay, and this is his world. In the 15th chapter of Romans, he writes to them and he says, I'm looking forward to coming to you soon. And it's poignant because it never works out for him this way. And he says in the 15th chapter of Romans, and we think he writes it from Corinth, in the third missionary journey, he writes this church here, and he says, I'm looking forward to seeing you soon, to use Rome as a base of operations so that I may go to Spain and to the western Mediterranean. And his plan is to go out here. You see, he's already done this. He's not going to stay here and keep doing this over and over and over. He's covered here. He's covered these churches. They're up and running. It's going. And so what he wants to do is this. It never happens that way. He ends up arrested. He spends time in Caesarea in jail. He travels by ship. Shipwrecks on Malta for a while. In the end of the book of Acts, he ends up in chains in Rome. The book of Acts doesn't tell us, but first century documents tell us that Paulus was beheaded by the Emperor Nero and his friend Peter was crucified upside down. Okay, so that's his world. It's a city world. These are city places. One other kind of rough, fun thing I'll tell you, and if you want to take notes on this, the flavors of the letters are different because the context of the letters are different. When Paulus left Syrian Antioch and he traveled here along the coast, these are the communities of the Galatians. The Galatia is a region, not a city. Anything with the prefix Gal means Celt. We believe these were Celtic peoples. What do we know about Celts and Scotland? Well, first of all, most Southerners have a little bit of Celt in them, some way or the other. What do we know about Celtic people? They live in Scotland and Ireland, and they live in western France and Cornwall and sort of Wales and wild places. Celts typically, because of displacement by the Roman Empire, typically lived in more remote places. Celts have always been ornery people, which tells me that I have a church full of Celts. Okay, so, but anyway, so they're also very Gentile. And so Paul's letter to the Galatians is very much a Gentile context letter, and it's written to them, so that happens there. If you travel up here to Philippi, Philippi was a very Latin town. It was a place where Roman military officers retired. That was the place where Christianity perhaps was most under the gun. They were the most hostile to Christians in Philippi, which is ironic, and this is why, by the way, this is my favorite letter of Paulus's, Philippi. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Paulus, are you serious? They're throwing us in chains. They're beating us up. He wrote them from a jail himself. We're not sure where, maybe Ephesus. And yet he says rejoice. Just rejoice. Be free of it. Hey, a little like, what's the name of the key? Jesus, right? A little like the Airbnb guy chained to a piece of the Berlin Wall. Unlock it. Be free. Okay, so Thessalonica, proudly Greek city, even though it was a Roman city, it was very Greek in its orientation and its history and its language. And then down here to good old Corinth, Paul spent more time in Corinth in residence than any other city. You know why? Because Corinth is New Orleans. That's right. It is. It's bawdy, port town, a lot of money coming through there. Very interesting people, great company, and they probably had a Galatoire's. So, right. So that's the world. That's the world of Paul. I mean, that's his world. Jesus' world, very small. This is why the letters are different. They're to different people, bound by commerce and good roads. Paulus also uses, I'm going to close with this, he also uses Greco-Roman rhetorical devices. Now, this is a good example of how, this is what we'll do next year, of how Paulus's letters can be misused. If Paulus only wrote out of the air, I think I'm going to give a list of do's and don'ts, right? Well, then all you have to do is make sure you have this handy list of sins and trespasses down and make sure you don't do these. Okay, just don't do it. And this is doctrine, right? No, he was writing to people. He was writing to people, and in Galatians chapter 5, what he's doing is he's using a rhetorical device called vices and virtues. And this is what people did in the academy. This is the way the teachers taught. Give them the wrong and then give them the correction. Vices and virtues. And so he's listing some vices. Live by the Spirit, I say. Do not gratify the desires of the flesh. He's sort of using a Greek idea about spirit and flesh, and he's using it in a Christian context to turn it on its head. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit. What the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you're led by the Spirit, you're not subject to the law. Now, the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, check, 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 dissensions, factions, envy, check, check, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I'm warning you as I warned you before. Those who do not do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And I tell my old seminary joke again, you've all heard it 20 times. A classmate looks at mine, we're studying Galatians chapter 5, and he goes, oh my gosh, the only thing I haven't done on this list is sorcery. Right, so why did he miss this? Okay, well what he's doing is he's using a rhetorical device of vices and virtues, and he leads with the vices because then he's going to talk about the gifts of the Spirit, not the works of the flesh, gratify the desires of the flesh, not the works of the flesh, but rather the fruits of the Spirit. Okay, the fruits of the Spirit. And you're saying, well, okay, right. Well, is this helpful? Well, it kind of is. I mean, if you don't do these things, you'll be okay. I mean, sure, don't do any of that. Don't do it, and you'll be okay. But is that really what he was trying to do? If you go to the original language, you can discover some things. For instance, carousing. It's a Greek word, kamos. Let me tell you about kamos. This was an all-night riotous affair that usually ended up in kidnapping and rape. By the way, of all these lists in Galatians chapter 5, almost all of these end up badly for women. And most times women and children. But at least women. They always end up badly for women. So, kamos is an all-night riotous affair ending in kidnapping and rape. Rape. I mean, they lived in cities were tough places. They could be tough places. Impurity, akathrasia. That's not just, impurity as in that sort of judgmental, I'm pure, you're not pure. That's not just thoughts. Really what this is a contagion like Ebola. It's the kind of impurity that literally poisons a community. I'll offer a poison right now, and I'm going to attempt to have a prayer at the next service for this boy who was beheaded by ISIS again today. Right? You better get on your phone, get your notification on your phone. Another murder by ISIS. Okay, that's a contagion. We cannot allow this kind of evil to exist in the world. We can't do it. We can't. The part of the puzzle of this is how do you contain it? How do you stop it? But it has to be stopped. I mean, we all know if we are to live by the ethic of the Good Shepherd, is we cannot live in a world where people murder each other in this wanton way. Now, that also includes Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. That also includes anywhere where evil is allowed to go unchecked, including our own inner cities. We have to fight evil where we are commanded by God to be agents of good in the world. And so this is what Paul is saying. Impurity here is a contagion like a disease. Can't laugh. Sorcery, the one I made the joke about. Does that look like a familiar word? Sure, pharmakia. It's where we get the word pharmacy. All you pharmacists out there, you sorcerers, down there at CVS, taking away our pig, No. Let me tell you. Thank y'all for laughing this morning, by the way. I'm kind of tired from football. Pharmakia. No, really, what this word simply meant was the art of poisoning. The art of poisoning. People would order up a hit on somebody. They'd order up poison and kill off a wife or a husband or somebody. They also would order up blood potions in which they would sadly would involve the murder of a child, and then part of that child's body would be used for a potion to create a blood potion. And this was evil. This was evil stuff. What Paul's trying to say is that it's a bad world out there. We're called to be different. We're called to be lights. I'll close with a thought that I want you to know that it's a thought in progress, but I'm beginning to connect some dots with regards to Paul. I'm really in love with this guy. I think he was the man of the hour. I think he stepped up to the plate in the last few years of his life and changed the world. I'm so happy that it saved his life and his work and his letters, and it became scripture for us. I'm beginning to appreciate the genius of the man. We have another genius coming to St. Luke's in January. His name is David Brooks. And he writes every Friday for the New York Times. He's also on television on Friday nights, and he's on the radio on Thursdays as a political commentator, but he's not going to talk to us about political things. David Brooks is not a Christian. He's a Jewish person, but he appreciates Christianity and probably knows as much about us as we do about ourselves. He loves St. Augustine. He loves Christian theologians, and he quotes them all the time. He says that Christianity could be an unstoppable force if we would only get out of our own way. And I want him to say that to us when he comes to Birmingham. What he talks about on last Friday's column in the New York Times, you can Google it, it's about moral agency. Moral agency is an old-fashioned term that just simply means, agency means becoming a force of good in the world, not dependent upon externals. In other words, you don't let the winds of whatever's going on in your life buffet you. It's almost like a rudder, holding your hand on a tiller, if you will, through a storm. I'm going to be the good person God made me to be, and I'm going to make a difference in the world, even if it costs me. Even if it costs me business, or it costs me friends, or if I look like a fool. I'm just going to be different in the world, right? I'm going to be kind. I'm going to forgive. I'm going to listen. I mean, I'm not going to follow the herd, if you will. I'm not going to let social media corral me into a corner of the like-minded. That's what, well, it's a little like the West German guard, right? Carrying around the law. He never really could fully live because he was carrying around something external, something that had happened to him that was real, something that was painful, and yet he's unlocked with the key, and the key is Jesus. How do we become moral agents? How do we find this freedom? And by the way, David Brooks even says, when one becomes a moral agent, one experiences the joy of growing up. You hear what I said? I think we live in a very adolescent world right now, and I think we just need to grow up. You know, it is hard out there, but it's also beautiful out there. And we just need to grow up and lead, and grow up in love, and grow up and learn, and grow up and serve. How do we get that? Well, I believe that Paulus grew up on the road to Damascus. I think he grew up when Jesus called him and saved him and healed him. I think he grew up when he realized that on his own he had utterly failed. He was a failure. And he knew it. And he knew that God loved him anyway. And when he realized this, that he's not saved by his own bootstraps, but rather saved by grace, he changed the world. How about us? We're his legacy. We're what he left behind. Okay, so come see me next week. We'll have some highlights of the world of Paul, but I'll close us with a prayer. Father in heaven, thank you so much for this gathering of friends and a time to study your word, to think about you, and also to thank you for Paulus and all those who have gone before. Help us to be the church, not a place to arrive to or to fight over or an organization to join, but rather a people. Help us to be Jesus in the city of Birmingham. And we pray these things in your holy name. Amen. Thanks, guys.